Hey, how's it going, everyone? It's Lee Halliday, and today we are learning about Cloudflare Workers, and specifically we're going to build an allow-denied list based on your IP address. So we're going to allow certain IPs access to our website, and we're going to block everyone else. And we're going to be doing this using Redis. So we're going to be storing the IP addresses that are allowed in Redis, and we'll be sort of intercepting requests and denying ones that aren't in the list. So if you haven't worked with Cloudflare Workers before, it's obviously a product by Cloudflare, which I use for my DNS hosting. And it's this code that sort of sits in the middle of a request from a user to your server. So if we head over to this image that they have, this is the example where visitor to example.com makes a request to your website from their browser or wherever. The Cloudflare worker sits in the middle. So very much like service workers within the browser, they can intercept requests and they can modify them, both the request going out and the response coming back. They can sort of stop the request from going out to your server, or they can just let it pass on through. So we're going to be building this code that sits in the middle here, intercepts requests, and then based on the IP address decides whether to allow it on or whether to just respond that it's blocked. There's a great article by Lisa on the Upstash blog on how to implement this allow deny list. I sort of took this as the starting point, but we're going to work through the whole from start to finish of how to start from zero and how to get it deployed and working on a domain that you own. It took me about 8 hours yesterday to figure out how the heck all of this entire ecosystem works. But it all starts with this thing called Wrangler. Wrangler is a CLI tool that you can use locally to help with your development, and you can sort of run these Cloudflare workers locally, just like you're doing local host development. So I'll link to this instructions on how to get started. But what we're going to start with is this TypeScript template. It seems like the easiest way to get up and running, building out a Cloudflare worker. So I'll share this, and we're going to start from the same point, and we basically just have to copy this line of code here, and we'll go down to our terminal, and I will get over and we'll change the name of this project to the allowed, we'll just call it allowed. So we'll run this, it's downloading the template, and then we can cd into the allowed folder, and we'll just npm install everything, and then we'll go take a look at the code. So this won't take too long to get set up, and then we will, open our code. And there's not too much going on in this example, but there are two files I want to touch on. I'm just going to remove the test folder because we're actually not going to be doing any tests today. But they do have a setup that you can use to sort of like mock out the service worker and test that it's working okay. Maybe I'll save that for a follow-up video if you're interested. So we're going to delete this, and there's two things. So there's this wrangler.toml file, and this is where we configure what our Cloudflare worker is called, what account ID it lives under, what type of code it is, because they support Rust and C++ or C or something like that. We're doing TypeScript that will compile to JavaScript, and why don't we just fill in these two things right now? So I have my Cloudflare dashboard open. Free accounts are fine for all of this, and I'm going to go and copy my zone ID, and then we'll copy my account ID as well. And we can just leave the rest blank. I don't think we're going to touch it anymore. So close this. Now head over and I'll show you sort of an intro of what these things actually look like. So they start listening for an event, and the event we're listening for is a fetch event. So remember, if you go back to this image, the user makes a fetch request to your server, and we're sort of sitting in here in the middle intercepting this request. So we've intercepted it. Here's the event with all of the information about this incoming request. And then it's up to us to basically decide how are we going to respond. What are we going to make the user's request do? Will we allow it to continue on? Will we respond with some text? It's up to us. And we're going to pass the event request to a function called handle request. And right now, all it's doing is basically every single request that goes through this Cloudflare worker is going to respond with some text that says request method and then like get request or post request or whatever. So why don't we run it so we can see what this looks like. The first thing you're going to want to do is click type Wrangler login, and that will make sure that you have your right Cloudflare API key and all of that stuff. I've already done it, so I'm going to skip that step and just say Wrangler dev. So Wrangler dev will build this, and then it will give you a local host URL that you can visit. And then we see this text, request method get. So why don't we come in here and tweak it a little bit. So what we can actually do is we can grab the IP address that my request is coming from. So we'll say const IP is equal to request headers, and we are going to get a header specifically that is CF connecting IP. So this is a special header that Cloudflare gives you about the user's IP. And just because it could be null, we're going to default with nullish coalescing to an empty string, just to keep TypeScript happy. So now we could put in here from, and we can embed the IP address. I'm saving it. It automatically detects changes, rebuilds your script, and then we can refresh. And now we get that this request is coming from 70.29. So this is my IP address. Great. So let's continue with this example where we're trying, the end goal is to basically block this request unless this IP address is in a Redis database that we're hosting on Upstash. So we're going to work our way towards that example. And the next thing we're going to do is basically check to make sure that this IP address is in the allowed list. So we're going to say, we'll just put a variable here, allowed, and it is going to call a function that won't exist yet, but we're going to await for this function, and then we'll call it is IP allowed, and we'll pass in the IP address. So we can just declare this right here below. So it's an async function, is IP allowed, and the IP is going to be a string, and it is going to resolve to Boolean, just like that. So if we just return false right here, so it doesn't like that, right? Because it's an async function, we have to say that it's going to be a promise that will resolve to a Boolean. So now it's happy, and we'll check here. If allowed, and then we can, if it's allowed, we could do something. We can allow it to continue on to where it was trying to go to. Why don't we handle the blocking right now? So if not allowed, and then we'll return a new response that says something like IP is not allowed. And we'll be nice and we'll set the status of the response to 403, which I think is forbidden. Cool. So that means if we get down to here, that means this IP address is allowed. So why don't we just change it and we say IP whatever is allowed. Like that. We'll let it rebuild, which just takes a second. We can refresh, and then we get this IP address blah blah is not allowed. Okay. So we obviously need to go fill in this is IP allowed function here, and for that we're going to go set up a Redis database on Upstash. So I'm going to go to my Upstash console that I've already logged in. So if you hadn't logged in, you'll click here, click on console. I do GitHub Connect because it's pretty easy, and I keep my sort of development logins together. And we'll create a database. We'll just give it the same name as our app, allowed. And I'm going to put this in, we'll say North Virginia. Yes, we want TLS. And yes, strong consistency. And this just takes a few seconds to get set up. And then we'll be good to sort of continue on with the rest of this example. Awesome. So the one cool thing that Upstash gives you that most or all other Redis providers don't is that they allow you to connect to your Redis database both through the typical Redis connection tools. So if you click on Redis Connect, you can use Node Redis in Node, you can use IO Redis, you can connect through Python. So you can connect the typical way, but we can't do that in this scenario because you can't install these and use these inside of the Cloudflare Workers. So instead what they give you is a RESTful API for you to interact with your Redis database. So we're going to copy this URL and later we'll come back for this header here, but we'll just do one thing at a time. So what we're going to do is we're going to say the URL is going to be this. So this is how we connect to our database, and then these are sort of the functions that we're performing on Redis. So the function that we're performing here is set. So a set is a unique array where we're going to store all of the IP addresses, and we're just going to be checking if something is a member of this set. So it's S is member. So what set are we looking in? We will call this the allowed set. And then we need to pass in the IP address that we want it to check for. So we can just embed the IP address in the end like that. So then we want to make the fetch request to this RESTful Redis API. So we'll say response is equal to await fetch to this URL. And we need to pass some headers. So we need to pass in the authorization header. So we can say authorization is equal to bearer, and then we need to put in the basically the access key, the token or the password that will allow us to connect to our Redis database. So I'm going to copy this, and yes, I could just embed it in like this, call it a day, but it's not a good idea to commit this and leave it sitting in your code. And there's actually a better way with Cloudflare Workers and the Wrangler CLI tool to put this in as a secret. So that's what we're going to be doing. We are going to be cutting this out and replacing it with, we'll just call it our Redis password, just like this. So it's TypeScript's freaking out right now, cannot find this. Don't worry, we'll take care of that in a second. But instead we're going to get out of this tool, running the Wrangler dev, and we're going to instead say Wrangler secret, and then that will tell us what commands we can run. And we're going to put a new secret, and we will call this our Redis password, the same variable I just used in the code. Run this, it's going to ask us to paste in that secret, and it's creating the secret for the script that was named allowed from our wrangler.toml file. And it's up there on Cloudflare now, so now we can use this Redis underscore password. So this script would actually run, but right now TypeScript is blocking us from being able to run it because it still doesn't know where it's getting this value from. So what we're going to do is just create a new file, .d.ts, where you can declare sort of global TypeScript variables. And we're going to declare const redis pw, which is a string. So this would make our script happy, but we need to tell our TypeScript config to include that new file that we created, because right now it's only looking in the src folder. So we'll just put .d.ts like that. And it might take a second, but that should eventually, perfect, make TypeScript happy. So it will read this global definition file, know that Redis PW is available to us, and now we can actually use this. So when you run Wrangler dev next and it spins up, it will actually inject this Redis PW password variable into our script. So it pulls it down from Cloudflare, the secret we just uploaded. Okay, next we need to basically get the result back from the our Redis database. So what we're going to do is we're going to say data is equal to await, and we just need to convert the response into JSON. And for now, I'm just going to say console.log. So we're still going to return false. We're not using it yet, but let's just see what Redis is giving back to us. So if we go back here, we refresh the page, and then we should be showing us. Sometimes it takes a second. There we go. So this is what Redis is giving us back. It's giving us back result that's either going to be a 0 if it is not in the set, or a 1 if it is, the IP address. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to say result like that, and we're going to give it a type hint, and we're going to say result is going to either be a 0 or a 1. So what we can do now is we can just say return result is equal to 1, just like that. So basically, if it's equal to 1, you're allowed, otherwise you're denied. So at this point, we should still be denied, so it still is not allowed. And maybe we should go at ourselves so that we can see what it looks like when you are allowed. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the Upstash console, close this, and I'm going to go back into Redis Connect, and the Redis CLI is right here. And this is basically how to connect to this Redis dashboard from the Redis CLI tool that I've installed locally using Homebrew. When you just do brew install Redis, you also get the Redis CLI along with it. So we're going to copy this. Why don't we just go to a new tab so we don't have to stop Wrangler over here. And I'm going to connect here. So now I can interact with this same Redis database, but from my console. And I'm going to call the command sadd for set add. So the key that I'm doing it to is the allowed set, and then the member. So this would be the actual IP address that I want to add to the set. So I haven't memorized my IP address, so let's go copy and paste it. And boom, it's in there. So it should be, if we go back and refresh now, it's allowed. So I've just added my IP address to the allow list, so now I can visit correctly this website. So remember this beautiful diagram. Visitor visits website, worker checks to see if my IP address is in the correct set, and if it is, it should allow the request to go to where it was heading in the first place. Otherwise, it will respond with denied. Okay. So we're at like an incomplete example right now. I said we're going to allow the request to continue on to the endpoint, but like, where is this request going? I'm just going to like 127.0.0.1, etc. So what I need to do is, instead of returning responses allowed, I need to basically allow that fetch request to continue on. And I'm going to put in one little thing to basically allow for this to work well locally, or when I've deployed this up to Cloudflare. And what we're going to be doing is attaching it as a route to a subdomain that I have, workers.leeholiday.com. So we're going to check as route, and the way we're going to basically do this is first look at the URL where the request is going to. So the way we get that is we can just say new URL is request.url, and then what we can do is we can say if it does not, url.host.end with workers.dev. So why this? When you deploy your Cloudflare worker up there, they'll sort of give you a URL, workers, like something allowed.leeholiday.workers.dev. So if we're just accessing this website via this URL, what we're going to do as route is just respond with IP address is allowed. Otherwise, actually, I want it the opposite. if not as route, sorry about that. So if it is a route, meaning we've attached it to an actual subdomain, and if this is confusing, hopefully it will make more sense in a second when I actually attach it to a subdomain. So if it's a route, we are going to return, just fetch, allow the request to continue on this request. Otherwise, we'll return just IP is allowed. And this is basically for testing whether it's working locally. So to illustrate this point a little bit better, why don't I console.log these things? So the URL and the as route in there. We'll just make sure it builds correctly, and then I'll show you what it's doing. Hopefully I didn't mess up. Oop. Wrangler watch, change message failed to send. I don't know, why don't we just restart it? Okay, I think it's doing okay. So we're going to come back here, refresh it. So we're still allowed, right? Let's go check what it was logging out. So URL as route false. So I actually just want, why don't we do the URL.host like that. Let it build, upload, okay. So refresh. Cool. So even though I'm running it on localhost dot whatever 8787 port, what it's actually doing is it's proxying the request to this allowed.lehalliday.workers.dev, which is where my Cloudflare worker is running on. So it's sort of weird, and what we actually want to do is basically have this Cloudflare worker listening to requests going into workers.lehalliday.com. So this subdomain I've already set up in Cloudflare. So if I go to DNS, I am pointing workers as a CNAME over to Vercel. So if I were to go to Vercel, I've added workers.lehalliday.com as one of the subdomains that's attached to this specific app. That's the landing page for my next level Next.js course. So this subdomain is already set up and it's good to go. And what I want to basically do is tell Cloudflare to basically intercept requests to this subdomain and pass it through the Cloudflare worker that we got set up. So to do that, we first need to publish our worker. So we can do that with Wrangler publish. And what that's going to do is basically upload this worker to Cloudflare. So it will just take a second, and now it's available at this domain that we were looking at before. So you can see it's now available live and it's allowed. And that's why I had this code here to basically check if I'm just running off of this workers.dev, don't allow the request to keep going because it's not really trying to go anywhere. It's just trying to check if I'm allowed or denied. So return that it's allowed. But if it's running elsewhere, so if it's not on this workers.dev domain, allow it to continue on. So we're going to attach it now to my workers.lehalliday.com subdomain. So we're going to go into workers. You can see here if I go into manage workers, I have my one worker here. It's sort of cool. It gives you some stats about like how many requests is it receiving and how long does each request take. So it takes like under a millisecond, which is crazy. That's how fast your call to Redis is, which is insane. But we want to attach this to a route. So we're going to add a route, and we basically tell Cloudflare like what subdomain or what types of requests should pass through this Cloudflare worker. So we're going to allow it to listen to anything on workers.lehalliday.com, any path. We could limit it to just the API path if we want, but we're going to allow it on anything. And we're going to attach our allowed worker here. Okay, so now when I visit workers.leeholiday.com, it should still be the same because my IP address is allowed. So it's allowing that fetch request to continue on to the endpoint. But what if we were to go back into the Redis console and say, remove from set, the allowed set, my IP address. So 29.72.165. Okay, so my IP address is blocked now. So now if we come back here and refresh, it just took a second, but IP address is not allowed. So anyone that tries to go to workers.leeholiday.com, that request is being routed through the Cloudflare worker. So if we come back here, we are checking to see if the IP address is allowed. If it's not allowed, it responds with this, which is what we're seeing here. If it is allowed, I've got this if statement. So if it's attached to a route, in this case it is because it doesn't end with workers.dev, we're going to allow the request to go through. Otherwise, we're just going to say it's allowed. So I could come back here and I could re-add the IP address to the allowed set. Come back here, refresh, on the actual one, and it allows the request to go through. So we just built an IP address allow deny list with Cloudflare Workers storing the IP addresses in Redis. One question that may come up is why store them in Redis when Cloudflare has its own key value pair database, distributed database you can use. And the reason is Redis you can connect to through a lot of different ways and a lot of different tools, such as this Redis CLI here that I'm using in the console, such as Rails application, a PHP app, a Node app, Next.js, wherever. So it gives you a lot more flexibility to connect any way you want to and manage your allow and deny list. Whereas if it's using the database that the key value database that Cloudflare provides, you don't have that level of flexibility. So that's why I chose to use Redis through the Upstash REST API that they have. You can even see the documentation, the throughput, the graph that my Redis database is receiving, and how many connections it has, and number of keys, and all that stuff. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you wanted to take this further, on the Cloudflare documentation, they have a ton of fantastic examples of like how you could just return like HTML, how you can redirect the user to a different request, how you can do A/B testing. So depending maybe what cookie is coming in with the request, you could serve up one website or another. How you can alter the incoming headers or the response headers. And there's a ton of different things you can use when you're sort of intercepting that request and sitting in the middle, such as what we covered today, building an allow deny list, deploying it, publishing it up to Cloudflare, and then attaching it to a route so that it can block or allow requests going to my app hosted on Vercel. So you can see how fast it is. Just as an example, if I go into the network tab, sometimes it's a bit slower than others. There we go, there's a fast one. So 183 milliseconds, it went from my browser through Cloudflare up to Redis and back to check if I'm allowed, and then to Vercel and back, all in 183 milliseconds, which is pretty crazy. But as we saw earlier, the worker itself isn't actually taking very long to process the request. 1 millisecond of sort of CPU processing time. Now, keep in mind, CPU processing time is different than actual time because when it's waiting for the request to return from Redis or wherever, that doesn't count as CPU processing time. That just counts as like waiting time in the node event loop. But anyways, these are details that don't matter. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'll publish the code so you can follow along yourself. Take care. Bye.